Hey guys, tonight I want you to imagine this. It's the dead of winter in a medieval village somewhere in the heart of 14th century Europe. Snow is falling like powdered silence over the thatched rooftops. The sky hangs heavy with gray, and a bitter wind cuts through the bare branches like a knife. There's no heating oil, no electric blanket, and certainly no thermostat to nudge up a few degrees. Just a mud hut, a fire, if you're lucky, and whatever warmth you can wring out of hay, wool, and each other. Sounds impossible to survive, right? And yet they did. So how did medieval peasants, most of them poor, cold, and constantly on the edge of survival, make it through those brutal winter nights without freezing to death? Let's walk through it together, not as modern spectators, but as if we're there. Because their story isn't just about cold weather, it's about resilience, invention, and the sheer will to endure. First off, let's talk about shelter. You might think a medieval peasant's home was just a crude hut, and to be fair, it kinda was. Most were made from wattle and daub, thin wooden sticks woven together, then smeared with mud and straw. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The walls were thick enough to keep out the wind, and the thatched roof, while leaky at times, offered some insulation. The trick was in the layout, a single room for everything. Sleeping, cooking, eating, even livestock, they were all packed into that tight space. And that, believe it or not, was by design. See, the animals weren't just a food source or a livelihood. In winter, cows, goats, and chickens doubled as space heaters. Their body heat helped warm the room, and their presence meant you weren't truly alone. Cozy? Maybe not, but practical? Absolutely. You might say the family cow was the medieval version of central heating, just smellier. And speaking of heat, let's not forget the hearth. If there was one sacred spot in every peasant home, it was the fire. Not a fireplace as we know it, but a simple pit in the middle of the floor, smoke curling up through a hole in the roof, or, sometimes, just finding its way out through cracks. The hearth wasn't just for cooking, it was the beating heart of survival. When the wind howled outside and frost crept along the edges of your bedding, that fire kept you alive. But wood was precious. You couldn't just burn it recklessly. Fuel had to be scavenged, fallen branches, dried animal dung, even twisted bundles of straw. Children were often tasked with gleaning the woods for anything burnable, and when you couldn't find enough, you learned to ration. Keep the fire low, huddle close, and sleep in shifts, so someone was always tending the embers. Now let's talk about what you were wearing. Peasants didn't have wardrobes filled with fleece and fur. Most had one or two tunics, maybe a cloak if they were lucky, but they layered what they had. Linen closest to the skin, then wool on top. Wool was a godsend. It was warm even when damp, which mattered a lot in those damp stone villages. If you had a sheepskin or a fur-lined hood, you were living large. And don't underestimate the power of hay. Peasants stuffed it into mattresses, boots, and even between layers of clothing for insulation. It might itch, but when your toes are turning purple, comfort takes a backseat to warmth. Sleeping arrangements were all about conserving heat. Beds weren't separate little islands. Families slept together, often on a shared mattress stuffed with straw or feathers. Children, parents, grandparents, all in a heap. If you think that sounds awkward, remember, warmth meant survival. There's a reason phrases like three-dog night exist. When it's that cold, you sleep with whatever and whoever keeps you warm. Now imagine the scene. It's pitch dark. The only light is the faint flicker of embers, and the air smells of smoke, damp wool, and animals. A baby fusses in the corner. Someone coughs. But for a brief moment, there's a stillness. Everyone is bundled, breathing slow and deep, suspended in that delicate balance between cold and comfort. That's winter survival, peasant style. But surviving the cold wasn't just about physical tricks. It was also about food. Calories were your fuel. The more you ate, the more heat your body could generate. Winter meals weren't elaborate, but they were dense. Thick porridges, root vegetables, cabbage, beans, stale bread softened in broth. If you had meat, usually salted pork or dried fish, it was a rare blessing. Fermented and preserved foods helped bridge the gap when gardens went dormant and hunting was scarce. And drinks. Hot ones helped more than you'd think. Ale, if you could spare the grain to brew it, was safer than water and helped warm you from the inside. Herbal teas boiled from foraged plants were common too. Nettle, mint, chamomile. And you better believe people drank broth by the bowlful. Every scrap of bone or leftover vegetable was turned into something that could keep you going. Let's take a second here. Can you picture it? A family crouched around a pot, stirring slowly, the steam rising into the smoky air. Someone ladles out a thick soup, hands trembling from the cold but grateful just the same. These weren't feasts, but they were meals born of ingenuity and necessity, and they got people through the night. And through it all, one thing kept people going more than anything else: community. When survival is on the line, you don't go it alone. Villagers shared food, blankets, labor, even body heat. They took turns watching each other's fires, helping patch roofs, tending to the elderly or the sick. The cold didn't just punish individuals, it tested entire communities. And it was only together that they could endure it. Did they complain? Of course. Wouldn't you? But they also sang songs, told stories, and kept traditions alive that reminded them who they were. Winter wasn't just a season. It was a ritual, a rite of passage. And making it through to spring was a victory worth celebrating. And sometimes it was pure luck. Not every village had the same resources. A bad harvest could spell disaster. A sick cow could mean no milk all winter. And if the weather turned cruel, ice storms, snow drifts, frozen rivers, you just did your best and hoped you'd see the thaw. But the peasants weren't helpless victims. They were hardened, clever, and deeply in tune with the land. They read the signs of the sky. They knew when to prepare. And they passed down knowledge through generations. How to build a windbreak with woven reeds. How to layer stones to trap solar warmth. How to tan hides and mend wool with nothing but bone needles and sinew. Surviving medieval winters was never easy. But in a way, it shaped who they were. It taught patience, resilience, and gratitude. It reminded them of their place in the cycle of life, and of the strength that comes from enduring hardship with grit and with grace. So the next time you're snuggled under a blanket, sipping cocoa, and listening to the wind outside, think about the people who faced that same wind with little more than firelight and faith. Think about the hands that gathered kindling, the boots stuffed with hay, the babies wrapped in linen and wool, asleep under thatched roofs. That's how they made it, not through comfort but through courage. And that's just the beginning. By now, the fire in the center of the hut has burned down to a glowing bed of embers. The baby is finally quiet, and the wind outside whistles through the cracks in the wooden door. Everyone's huddled together, wrapped in every scrap of wool they own, listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling under the weight of snow. But winter's not done testing them, not even close. Because cold isn't the only enemy in a medieval winter. There's hunger, there's illness, there's the crushing boredom of long, dark nights that stretch for 16 hours or more. And there's the slow, gnawing anxiety that maybe this year, spring won't come in time. So let's talk about boredom first, because it's easy to underestimate. When you live in a one-room hut with no light after sundown, and nothing but chores and survival to think about, your mind starts to wander, and not always in a good way. That's why storytelling became so important. Oral tradition was more than entertainment. It was therapy, education, and spiritual resilience. Parents told tales of saints and sinners, witches in the woods, kings who lost their crowns, and animals who outwitted their hunters. These stories had morals, warnings, and sometimes just enough humor to break the silence. It's how people passed on values, skills, and bits of hope. Even the fire seemed to listen, crackling in rhythm with each twist in the tale. And then, of course, there were songs. Even if you had nothing, no coin, no shoes, you still had your voice. Folk songs, lullabies, chants, they stitched community together like thread in a worn tunic. Music warmed what blankets couldn't. It soothed babies and stirred the hearts of tired men. It helped keep rhythm during chores and held meaning in ceremonies from baptism to burial. Now let's shift gears a little. Because if we're talking about survival, we can't skip over illness. Winter brought more than frostbite. It brought infections that spread in cramped quarters. Coughs turned to fevers. Cuts that didn't heal became deadly. With no antibiotics, no real medicine to speak of, peasants turned to remedies passed down by word of mouth. Herbal teas, poultices made from garlic, honey, or lard, and prayers whispered at bedside. The village wise woman, half healer, half herbalist, was often the first and last line of defense. Did these treatments always work? No, but sometimes they did enough, and sometimes believing in them was half the medicine. Cleanliness, of course, wasn't what we'd call modern. Bathing in winter was rare, mostly because water had to be hauled in and heated by hand. Washing too often could mean catching a chill you wouldn't survive. Instead, folks relied on layering to keep warm and dry, and used natural deodorizers like dried herbs or vinegar. But the true battlefield was the mind. Depression wasn't a word they knew, but the feeling. Oh, it was there. The hopelessness of losing a harvest. The dread of watching food stores shrink too fast. The grief of losing a child to fever or a husband to a wood-cutting accident. Those weren't just stories, they were Tuesday. Yet somehow people endured. And that brings us to one of the most overlooked winter survival tools, rituals. Every feast, fast, and holy day was a lifeline, an anchor in the endless dark. Christmas wasn't just about celebration, it marked a halfway point. Candlemas sent Bridget's Day, the first day lambs were born. These were signs, signals from the natural world that the wheel was still turning. Even chores had ritual, turning the compost heap just so, sharpening tools in a specific rhythm, hanging herbs in certain corners of the home for protection. It gave meaning to repetition, and meaning kept despair at bay. And while we're talking meaning, we should probably bring up faith. Religion was the cornerstone of a peasant's worldview, not always because of deep theological understanding, but because it was one of the few things that gave structure to hardship. People believed their suffering had a purpose, that the cold, the hunger, even the early deaths were part of a divine plan. It wasn't comfort necessarily, but it was clarity. In a way, faith was the one thing that winter couldn't freeze. Now, zooming back out, let's talk a bit about the bigger system these folks lived in. The manorial system. Most peasants weren't free to just pack up and go if things got bad. They were tied to the land, serfs working under a local lord. That meant that even in winter they might owe him food, labor, or taxes. Harsh, yes, but it also meant there was structure. Lords often stored grain for emergency use. The manor had communal ovens, larger barns, and sometimes even rudimentary hospitals run by monks or nuns. If you were lucky, your lord was generous. If not, well, winter would be longer. But within their tight-knit communities, peasants built informal safety nets. Neighbors helped each other patch roofs, chop wood, or share extra broth. They bartered services. I'll fix your cart if you lend me your goat for the night. Generosity wasn't charity, it was survival math. Which brings us back to something worth emphasizing. Peasant knowledge was deeply ecological. Modern people have Google. They had instincts, tradition, and memory. They knew which herbs eased toothaches, which mushrooms to avoid, how to read the stars to tell the seasons, how to preserve meat in underground pits, and how to trap rabbits when the snow was deep. It wasn't just about braving the cold. It was about working with the land even when it seemed hostile. Ever hear of bracken beds? Peasants used dried ferns as mattress stuffing. The dried bracken had antimicrobial properties and acted like insulation. That's not just luck, that's genius born from observation. Even roofing had science behind it. Thatch wasn't just dumped on. It was layered in a way that trapped air, like a feather duvet, while shedding water and snow. The angle, the materials, even the placement of smoke holes, they all mattered. Everything was earned through generations of trial and error. What worked was passed on. What didn't, well, those stories usually ended quietly. As we wrap this section up, picture this again. The winter wind still howls. The sheep huddle under a makeshift lean-to. A woman, barely 30 but already gray at the temples, kneels to check on her sleeping child. The fire has gone out. She slips a hand into the straw bedding, checks for warmth. Her fingers brush her husband's shoulder and he stirs. No words are needed. They've survived another night. And in the medieval world, sometimes that alone was a triumph. By morning, the frost clinging to the thatched roof has started to melt in thin, slow drips. A pale gray light slips through the gaps in the shutters. It's not warm, not by a long shot, but the silence of night has broken. And with that, the rhythm of the village begins again. You can hear it. The wooden latch of a door creaking open. A soft cough. A rooster that's decided, wrongly, that it's a good day to announce itself. Somewhere nearby, boots crunch through frozen mud. The peasants don't have the luxury of easing into the day. When you live by the sun, you rise with it, regardless of how much sleep you got or how numb your fingers still are. And here's where it gets really interesting. Winter work didn't stop. It just changed. You might assume that once the harvest was in, peasants had nothing to do until spring thawed the soil again. Not true. In fact, winter was busy, just in a different way. Let's start with animal care. In the bitter cold, animals needed tending twice as carefully. Chickens could freeze to death. Sheep could catch pneumonia. Cows had to be milked by hand, even when the buckets were half frozen and your fingers barely worked. Hay had to be rationed just right to make it through to March or April. You couldn't let them eat too much early on or too little and lose strength. And remember, these weren't pets. They were your heat source, your food, your livelihood. A cow dying in February might mean your family doesn't make it to May. Peasants didn't just share warmth with their animals. They sometimes shared space. In the simplest huts, livestock were brought inside at night, corralled into corners, tethered near the door. Their body heat added precious degrees to the air, and their presence was both comfort and insurance. Now, beyond caring for animals, peasants spent winter doing what we'd call preventive maintenance. Think sharpening blades, fixing tools, weaving ropes, making baskets, spinning wool by hand. All slow, meticulous work you couldn't rush even if you wanted to. A poorly tied fishing net meant starvation come spring. A dull scythe could ruin a summer harvest. So you used this time to prepare for the moment nature would allow you to plant again. Winter was also when repairs had to happen indoors, patching roofs with reeds or peat, tightening door hinges, reinforcing the walls with daub, a muddy mixture of straw, clay, and dung to keep out drafts. Every improvement, no matter how small, could shave off just enough cold to keep someone alive. And let's not forget about fuel. Peasants couldn't afford to burn through wood like there was an endless supply. Gathering firewood in winter wasn't just hard, it was dangerous. The roads were icy, the branches brittle, and the forest itself could be unkind. Peasants often turned to other sources. Dried dung, crop waste, or peat if they lived in the right region. Anything that could burn was hoarded with care. Children were taught early how to spot kindling in the frost, how to split twigs without wasting a sliver. Fuel wasn't just warmth. It was light, it was cooking, it was life. Which brings us to food. Imagine standing in your storage space, maybe just a root cellar dug into the hillside, holding a lantern made from animal fat and a scrap of rag. You look at your shelves. A few onions, some salted pork, barrels of fermented cabbage, maybe 2 wheels of hard cheese if you were lucky, a few smoked fish, beans in sacks, a pile of wrinkled apples already turning. Now imagine you've still got 2 months of winter left. Portioning was an art form. Women knew exactly how many spoonfuls of dried peas went into each pot of pottage. They knew how many days they could stretch a single ham hock by boiling it with barley and roots. The food was bland, often gray, but it was filling. And that was what mattered. Sometimes, to make things last, you went hungry. And sometimes, not often, but it happened, families would barter food between households. A neighbor with extra parsnips might trade for a cup of lard. That spirit of give and take kept people alive. But it wasn't always so cooperative. Desperation had a dark side, too. There were stories, some true, some probably embellished, of theft during the leanest months, of a neighbor's hen disappearing in the night, of a child caught sneaking turnips from another's pile. Punishments could be harsh, public shaming, a cold night in the stocks, or worse, being cast out when there was nowhere else to go. Still, most villages knew survival was a team sport. Which brings us to something that deserves more attention: the emotional ecosystem of a medieval winter. These people didn't just huddle together for warmth. They held each other through grief. They shared silence when words failed. When someone died, especially in winter, it wasn't just a loss. It was a blow to the village's very ability to survive. Yet somehow they found rituals for that too. Simple, powerful things: lighting candles, reciting psalms, wrapping the dead in wool and burying them before the ground froze too hard. Life and death weren't separate. They were folded into each other like layers of linen. And here's where storytelling loops back in. When you can't control the world around you, when the night seems too long, the frost too deep, the hunger too sharp, you tell stories to remind yourself that others have endured worse. That saints walked barefoot across snow. That Christ suffered in silence. That good things are promised to those who wait. And so they waited. They told stories by firelight. They carved new handles for tools. They stitched patches onto patches until a tunic was more repair than fabric. They listened for the first hint of birdsong in February. They watched the lambs being born and prayed that they'd survive. They prayed that they'd survive. Because at the heart of it all, winter wasn't just a season. It was a test of patience, of strength, of knowledge passed down through 100 generations. And most of all, it was a test of faith in the land, in each other, and in the quiet promise that warmth would come again. Now picture this: it's late February. The snow hasn't quite melted, but it's thinner now. Patches of black earth begin to peek through the crusted white like bruises on the land. The wind's still sharp, but it carries a different scent. Damp soil, wet straw, smoke that lingers longer in the air. You can feel it. Something's changing. And if you're a medieval peasant, you're paying attention, because this is the most dangerous moment of all. People assume the harshest part of winter is January, but in truth, it's the end of winter, that limbo between frost and thaw, when desperation reaches its peak. By now, stores are depleted. Fat has burned away from the body. Immune systems are weak. It's flu season before they knew the word flu. The chill seeps into your joints, into your gut, into your thoughts. They called it the hunger gap. The food you harvested last fall is nearly gone, but the earth hasn't offered anything new yet. No greens, no eggs, no milk if the livestock are sick or pregnant. It's a season of waiting, hoping, holding your breath. So what did they do? They foraged. Even in the leanest days, they searched for anything remotely edible. Nettles, chickweed, dandelion roots, tree bark boiled into bitter broth. Not glamorous, but enough to keep the belly from groaning too loudly. They dried lichen. They cracked bones to boil the marrow out. Children were sent to scout the stream banks for anything that moved: frogs, snails, even bugs. And believe it or not, these weeds often provided vital nutrients that saved lives. Nettles alone are packed with iron and vitamin C. It's wild, right? The very things modern people try to kill in their gardens were once life-saving staples. And this period, it wasn't just a hunger gap, it was a hope gap. This is when tempers flared, marriages strained. Elders sometimes gave up their meals so younger ones could eat. And yes, some people died, quietly, without fanfare. A child who went to sleep and never woke. An old man whose cough grew worse and worse until it just stopped. But it's also when people clung hardest to faith. You'd see them, wrapped in threadbare cloaks, making the long walk to the chapel. Bare branches overhead, muddy roads underfoot. The bells calling them to prayer were sometimes the only thing that kept the mind steady. They prayed for warmth, for rain, for healthy births, for enough strength to last another week. And this brings us to one of the most powerful survival tools peasants had: rituals. Not just religious ones, but everyday ones. Tiny acts that gave structure to the shapeless days. Lighting the fire the same way each morning. Stirring the pottage clockwise with the same spoon. Telling stories before bed. Singing the same lullabies. These weren't just habits, they were anchors. Because when the outside world is chaos, routine is a kind of resistance. A quiet rebellion against despair. And speaking of rebellion, let's talk about craft. Winter, for all its hardships, was also a time of creation. If you had wool, you spun it. If you had thread, you embroidered. Peasant women stitched designs into aprons and cloaks, not because they were trying to be fashionable, but because they needed something beautiful to hold on to. Men carved small trinkets from bone or wood, not just for tools but for meaning. Tokens, charms, memory holders. There's a kind of dignity in that. When the world around you is bare, you make beauty anyway. Even among the youngest, creativity was essential. Children weren't shielded from the cold, but they weren't crushed by it either. They made toys from scrap, dolls from rags, spinning tops from clay, balls from stitched pig bladders. And in the warmth of the hearth, they learned their place in the world. Grandparents, if they were still alive, told tales of winters past, stories of wolves in the woods, of ice so thick it sealed the river. Sometimes it was hard to tell where truth ended and legend began. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the telling, the passing on, the warmth of memory shared around a fire that crackled louder than the wind. And slowly, slowly, the season began to shift. The first sign, the lambing. Nothing changed the mood of a village faster than the arrival of newborn lambs. Their bleats were high and frantic, and their legs trembled like reeds, but they were alive. They were a promise. Mothers would wrap them in coarse cloth, even bring the weak ones inside the cottage, letting them rest by the hearth like sacred guests. If a lamb survived, so might the family. And then the trees would bud. The birds would return. The stream would unfreeze. Just like that, the dark grip of winter loosened. But make no mistake, it never let go without a fight. There were still frosts in March. There were still days when the food ran out before the snow did. There were still funerals. Yet somehow, year after year, the peasants endured. Not because they were stronger, not because they had more, but because they shared. They trusted in the rhythm of nature. And they found light, not in abundance, but in each other. Which brings us to perhaps the most underrated skill in surviving medieval winters, knowing that no one makes it alone. In a world of stone and snow, survival was never just about strength, it was about community. And that, more than any fire or cloak or salted pork, is what kept them alive. The thaw didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just a shift in sound. The muffled hush of snow gave way to dripping eaves. Icicles began to weep quietly at noon, and the thick silence of the woods broke open with bird song, raw, early, a little uncertain, but there. If you listened, you could hear the ground breathing again. And for medieval peasants, that sound, that was everything. It meant you made it, but don't get too comfortable yet. This part, the early spring, isn't just a return to warmth. It's payback time. All the things you put off during the freeze, now they come due. Roofs sagged under the weight of winter snow. Fences that kept the pigs in, broken. Thatched walls that once held firm, now soggy, torn, and inviting to every mouse in the parish. Everything needed fixing, and nobody had the luxury of waiting. And then, of course, there were the fields. Ah yes, the glorious muddy, back-breaking, leg-swallowing fields. Plowing started as soon as the ground was soft enough to break. No tractors, no machines, just oxen if you were lucky. Your own shoulders if you were. The blade cut through the half-frozen crust like it was dragging secrets from the soil. Stones, roots, worms, all twisted in a cold mess. The work was relentless. If you didn't prep in time, you didn't eat come summer. And you knew it. Every seed planted now was a gamble, a prayer. You planted hoping you'd still be around when the harvest came. And yet through it all, peasants found ways to celebrate. That's right. Right there in the cold mud, they marked the turning, with bonfires, with dances, with songs that had been passed down for centuries. These weren't elaborate royal court dances. These were stomps in the slush, hand-holding circles under bare trees, shouts that mixed laughter with steam. Because sometimes joy is less about circumstance and more about defiance. But let's back up a second. Before the first real planting, before the feast days returned, before the church bells rang for Easter, what did survival look like on a household level? It looked like cooperation. Every person, from the toddler to the toothless elder, had a job. Children collected firewood or scared away birds from the grain stores. Women spun thread, patched clothing, strained soup for any last bit of marrow. Men fixed tools, shaped handles, chopped wood, repaired carts. You didn't get days off. You got days alive. And speaking of tools, imagine trying to fix a wooden plow with nothing but an iron nail and your father's knife. Imagine boiling a deer hide until it softened enough to stitch into a shoe. Imagine trying to dry herbs while the rain blew sideways into your one-room cottage. It's one thing to survive the cold. It's another to keep going when the cold's gone, but everything else still hurts. Because let's be honest, surviving the coldest nights wasn't just about staying warm. It was about what the cold took from you and what you had to rebuild. There were emotional wounds, too. A mother might have buried a child. A man might have lost his only ox to illness. Some nights the grief felt heavier than snow on the roof. And yet they went on. They always went on. Because in medieval life there was no pause button, no time to mourn properly. You grieved while working. You remembered while rebuilding. You carried both the weight of sorrow and the urgency of survival in the same arms. But, and here's the strange, beautiful part, they also remembered joy. They passed it down like a lantern. They sang lullabies, not because they had perfect lives, but because lullabies meant the baby was still breathing. They carved flowers into their spoons, wove color into baskets, shaped bread dough into braids, because beauty was resistance. It reminded them that they were still human. Think of it this way. Winter tried to strip them down to nothing. But every morning fire lit, every pot of soup stirred, every joke shared over a cracked mug was a refusal to disappear. And with spring beginning to open its tired eyes, another chapter in the survival story began. The shift from enduring to rebuilding. The thatched roofs would need relayering, ditches dug anew, livestock counted, treated, fed, tools sharpened, relationships, too, mended over ale after long months of tight quarters and too little food. And slowly, so slowly, the village came back to life. The green returned to the hedgerows. The market carts rattled back into town. People started measuring time by daylight again, not just candle ends. You'd hear laughter echoing between cottages, not loud, not careless, but real. Laughter from people who knew they'd been tested and who somehow had come out the other side. They didn't write books. They didn't build monuments. But their story, this ancient, quiet mastery of survival, it lives in every fire we light, every neighbor we help, every moment we choose to keep going when it would be easier to quit. And in that way, we're not so different from them after all. Now, let's talk about the real game changer for surviving those brutal winters and rebuilding afterward: community. Because no matter how strong you were, no matter how clever or resourceful in the Middle Ages, you didn't survive alone. You survived together or not at all. So picture this. It's a muddy path just outside the village, snow still clinging to the corners of fences, and there's an old woman hauling firewood on her back. Her knees are stiff, fingers wrapped in rags, and she's doing her best not to slip. Then a boy, barely taller than the pile of kindling he's carrying, runs over to help. No one told him to. It's just what you do. That quiet code of helping, unspoken but ironclad, was woven into every part of life. When roofs caved in from heavy snow, neighbors showed up with ladders and thatch. When a family lost their cow, the village priest might gather spare milk from nearby homes. When someone was sick, another would chop their firewood or leave soup at the door. Even in the bleakest hours, the peasants had something the rich often didn't: each other. See, those crumbling one-room cottages we imagine from history books. They weren't just shelter. They were part of a network, a patchwork quilt of humanity held together by chores, gossip, shared bread, and survival. And when the coldest nights hit, it wasn't just about piling blankets or lighting fires. It was about trust, about knowing someone had your back, They shared more than food and tools. They shared information, like which herbs worked best for a bad cough, how to catch rabbits using nothing but a snare and a flat stone, which spot along the river stayed unfrozen just long enough to draw water before dawn. These weren't random tips. They were life-saving secrets, passed from one generation to the next like gold. Now imagine you're that boy from earlier, sitting near the hearth with your grandmother. The fire's low, you're half asleep, and she's telling you a story, not just for comfort, but because inside the story is knowledge. Hidden in the tale is how to smoke fish without losing its flavor, or how to find birch bark dry enough to light even in the dead of February. Storytelling was education. Entertainment, sure. But more than that, it was instruction for the soul. But here's something most people don't realize. Those winters didn't just test the body, they tested your spirit. When food ran low and tempers ran high, kindness became a kind of currency. Someone gives you half their onion. That wasn't just generosity. That was solidarity. Because if they gave you half today, maybe you'd give them half tomorrow. And when the cold pressed in and frost formed on the inside of your door, that hope, that someone cared, was sometimes the only warmth you had left. Let's not romanticize it though. Fights happened. Neighbors argued. People got jealous. But even in all that human messiness, the community held. Because deep down, every man, woman, and child knew one fire might warm a family. But a whole village, that could survive anything. And that's where things get interesting. Because out of that hardship, out of that clinging to one another like branches in a storm, came something beautiful: tradition. Ever wondered where things like wassailing or midwinter feasts or Yule logs came from? They weren't just about celebration. They were strategies, mental armor against despair. People didn't roast apples in cider and sing songs because life was easy. They did it because life was hard. And joy, that was rebellion. Lighting a candle when the nights were longest wasn't just a ritual, it was a promise, a statement. We're still here. They made wreaths, told tales, danced in circles around frozen fields, not out of naivety, but out of sheer stubborn hope. And while kings and lords built castles with stone, peasants built resilience with bread, song, and shared silence. Speaking of bread, let's talk about the little things that helped them push through. Things like spiced ale, when they had it, warmed slowly over a fire, the aroma of cloves cutting through the smoke. Or hot stones tucked into beds at night. Yes, really. Heated by the hearth, wrapped in cloth, placed at your feet to ward off frostbite. Or chest rubs made with goose fat and herbs, passed down from old wives who knew exactly which leaf soothed a hacking cough. Even how they slept changed during the coldest times. In the dead of winter, families didn't just huddle together. They layered themselves, sometimes even sharing beds with livestock, or with a thick wall of straw between sleeping spaces to trap heat. Clothing wasn't removed, it was added. Nightcaps, mittens, even wool-wrapped feet inside the bedding. Sleep became something less restful and more tactical, and every morning they woke up alive was a small victory. Because that's what winter taught them. Every day you woke up, took a breath, heard the cockerel crow. You D1. And the best part, they knew it. They didn't need medals or calendars to mark their survival. They had calloused hands, full bellies, and stories to tell. That was enough. So the next time you wrap yourself in a blanket and sip something warm, remember, it's not just comfort, it's heritage. You're echoing the choices of people who came before you, who endured longer nights, colder winds, and far fewer luxuries. People who faced the bitterest cold with grit, heart, and just enough stubbornness to make it to spring. And maybe, just maybe, their warmth is still with us, in how we help each other, in how we light candles when it's dark, in how we share the little we have. Because surviving the cold, it was never just about fire, it was about connection. Now if you're picturing all of this and thinking, okay, I get the people part, the fire part, the huddling together part, but how did they actually make it through months of this without modern food or medicine? Well, buckle up. Because here's the thing most people overlook. Surviving the coldest nights wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about managing everything: food, illness, water, sleep, even morale, over a long, relentless stretch where one mistake could cost your life. Let's start with food. Because winter was not a surprise, they knew it was coming. Every single harvest, every bit of smoke curling from a chimney, was in some way preparation for winter. So months before the frost hit, peasants dried their vegetables, smoked their meat, salted their fish, and hoarded whatever grains they could get their hands on. They made thick black bread from rye and barley, hard as stone, but it kept. They dug root cellars, stacked barrels, even tucked onions and turnips under straw in corners of the house. And they made stews, lots of them. Not fancy ones, more like a mix of cabbage, dried peas, a bit of old bacon, and if they were lucky, a bone with some marrow left. It simmered all day over a low fire, stretching scraps into a meal. And you know what? It worked. Because that stew wasn't just food. It was heat. It was comfort. It was something warm to gather around when the wind howled outside and the frost climbed the inside of your walls. But winter didn't just attack your belly. It attacked your health. Imagine trying to shake off a chest infection in a room where the temperature barely rises above freezing. Or dealing with chilblains, frostbite, cracked lips, and aching joints without ibuprofen or chapstick or heated blankets. So what did they do? They turned to the earth. Not just herbs, but real generational wisdom. They boiled elderberries and yarrow to break a fever, made poultices from garlic and goose fat to rub on chests. They chewed dried mint to soothe nausea and kept dried thyme to sprinkle in stews, not just for flavor, but because it helped fight off parasites. And perhaps most impressively, they knew the art of prevention. There was no such thing as hand sanitizer, but many households would rinse their hands in vinegar water, especially when someone got sick. Some villagers even burned dried rosemary or mugwort in the home, not just to cover up the stench of the livestock, but because they believed the smoke warded off disease. And honestly, they weren't far off. Some of those herbs do have antimicrobial properties, but here's what might surprise you most: hydration. Yep. Staying hydrated in winter was just as critical as in summer. When water froze over, peasants didn't have kitchen taps or Brita filters. They had to melt snow, boil ice from the river, or chip through frozen barrels. And if they weren't careful, they'd get sick. Because drinking bad water could cause everything from diarrhea to death. So the smart ones kept backup supplies, jars of boiled water hidden near the hearth. And they'd mix it with dried herbs to make weak teas, nettle, chamomile, mint. Anything that added flavor and maybe a hint of medicine. Now let's zoom out again. You've got your food. You've got some fire. Maybe even some cough remedy made from honey and sage. But what about the nights when all of that still wasn't enough? That's when the real challenge kicked in, mental survival. Because those nights were long. Longer than most of us today can really imagine. With the sun setting around 4 p.m. and not rising again until after 8 a.m., people spent over half the day in darkness. And that's where the human mind starts to unravel. Loneliness, despair, cabin fever. So what did peasants do? They created rituals, not religious rituals, though that helped too. But rhythms, small daily ceremonies that gave meaning to the hours. Morning started with fire lighting, always. That first puff of smoke curling from the chimney, that was a sign of life. Next came feeding the animals. Whether it was chickens, pigs, or a goat in the corner of the room, that act of care, that motion helped structure the day. After that, chores. Always something to do. Patch a boot, weave a basket, mend a tunic, stir the pot. Movement kept the body warm and the mind from spiraling. And then maybe, just maybe, came song. Yes, singing. Alone or together. Peasants weren't just farmers, they were storytellers, musicians, poets in their own way. They sang to pass time, to teach kids, to mourn the dead, to mock the Lord's taxes. And when voices rose together in a circle by the fire or outside while hauling wood, that song did more than lift spirits. It reminded people, you're not alone. The act of surviving together became its own kind of music. Now here's a curveball. You might be thinking, but what about the kids? How did they survive? Well, in many ways, children were both the most vulnerable and the most protected. Because when you live in a world where every extra mouth strains the food supply, choosing to protect a child was an act of faith. And protect them they did. Mothers would wrap their babies in layer after layer, wool, linen, even moss stuffed in cloth to trap body heat. Children were often tucked between parents at night, sharing warmth, wrapped head to toe in hand-me-down garments. They didn't bathe often in winter, not because they were lazy, but because wet skin meant hypothermia. And even in those dark months, kids learned. Through stories, chores, songs, they absorbed the skills they'd need to survive the next winter. And the next, because survival wasn't just something peasants did, it was something they taught. So when we look back now, it's easy to pity them, to think how awful it must have been with nothing but mud, firewood, and a prayer to carry them through. But here's the truth. They were some of the most resilient people who ever lived. Not because they had more, but because they made more of what they had. A flickering flame in the dark. A bowl of stew passed between hands. A child laughing despite the cold. That's how they made it. And they left us that legacy not in books or statues, but in the small habits we still cling to when the world feels too heavy. Light a candle, make soup, call your neighbor, tell a story, sleep close to someone you love. That's medieval survival, still alive today. And here's something you might not expect. Even in the dead of winter, when snow crusted the thatch and frost painted the inside walls, medieval peasants still found reasons to laugh. It wasn't denial, it was resistance. See, when the world outside is all bleak wind and frozen soil, joy becomes a kind of rebellion. They told jokes, sharp, clever ones passed down through generations. They poked fun at their lords, their neighbors, even themselves. Humor wasn't just entertainment, it was armor. When you've got nothing left to lose, a good belly laugh can be the difference between breaking down and pushing through. Evenings were the heart of that. Once chores were done, stew eaten, animals fed, and fire stoked, the village didn't just sleep, they gathered. Maybe it was in the largest house, or in someone's barn with the hay pushed aside. They'd sit shoulder to shoulder on benches or furs, huddled under cloaks and scratchy wool blankets. The air was thick with wood smoke and stories. That's when the elders spoke. Not just idle gossip, legends. Oral history was everything. They spun tales of saints and devils, brave farmers who tricked tax collectors, or that one guy from 3 villages over who supposedly wrestled a bear and lived. They told stories about winter itself, personifying it like a living thing. Sometimes it was an old woman with white hair who swept frost across your doorstep. Other times it was a hungry beast that prowled the forests looking for careless children. Were those stories true? Not exactly, but they worked. They kept kids near the fire and taught lessons disguised as wonder. Now, let's talk about the architecture of survival, because if you're imagining drafty, collapsing huts, think again. Peasant homes were humble, sure, but they were clever. Thatch roofs, excellent insulation when tightly packed, wattle and daub walls, surprisingly good at holding in warmth, especially when coated in limewash or animal dung. Yep, it sounds gross, but it worked like primitive plaster. Floors were often dirt but covered in rushes, layered grasses mixed with sweet herbs like lavender or meadowsweet to keep pests away and make things smell better. And animals, they weren't just outside. If you had a pig or a goat, they likely shared your living space. Not because it was cute, but because their body heat helped warm the room. In the harshest months, your home wasn't a house. It was a communal oven of survival. And there were tricks, little winter hacks passed from grandmother to daughter. Sleeping caps weren't just a fashion quirk. They prevented heat loss from the head. Hay-stuffed mattresses and wool blankets layered in a specific order, coarse on the outside, softer on the inside, trapped heat efficiently. Windows, if there were any, were small and shuttered, often covered with oiled cloth or scraped animal hide to block drafts. And every morning started the same way: restart the fire. That ember you tucked under the ash last night. You hoped it still glowed come dawn, because if not, you were starting from scratch. But sometimes, even the best prepared families didn't make it, because winter doesn't care how clever or kind you are, and that's when the village stepped in. One of the most underrated survival tools in medieval life: collective care. Neighbors checked on each other. If one family ran out of firewood, another would share a bundle. If someone's roof caved in from snow, others helped patch it with what little they had. And if a parent died, which happened more often than anyone wants to admit, someone always took in the children. Orphans were tragic, but rarely alone. Because here's what we forget: peasants were interdependent. Not just because it was nice, but because it was necessary. When life throws frostbite, famine, or fever at your door, your real wealth isn't your coin, it's your community. And that same bond extended to celebration. Yes, celebration, even in winter, especially in winter. Because as grim as those months could be, they were also sacred. Yuletide, for example, was one of the few times when even the poorest households found a way to feast. The darkest days were laced with ancient traditions, holly hung from doorways, songs sung in candlelight, simple offerings laid on the hearth for spirits long remembered. And oh, the food. It wasn't lavish, but it was meaningful. A dried apple, a slab of spiced bread, a handful of nuts saved from autumn. One goose roasted slow could feed a dozen people when paired with dark ale and roasted root vegetables. Everything tasted better by firelight, especially when shared. There was singing, too. Not polished choir songs, but raw, heartfelt melodies in strange old tongues. Sometimes in rounds, sometimes with drums or flutes if someone had them. And dancing, clapping, stamping, circling dances, not for beauty, but to generate heat and joy. This wasn't escapism. It was defiance. Because what better way to spit in winter's face than to throw a party in the middle of the darkest night? Now, I know what you might be wondering. Was it all romantic struggle and heartwarming solidarity? Of course not. There was hunger, death, arguments, people cracked under pressure, some stole, some despaired, some did terrible things to survive. But here's the core truth. Medieval peasants didn't survive because they were tougher than us. They survived because they relied on each other, because they adapted, because they listened to the land. Because they built systems, rituals, recipes, shelters, stories that honored the season rather than trying to conquer it. They didn't have thermostats or electricity or weather apps. They had each other, and somehow that was enough. As the harshest days of winter dragged on, another kind of cold set in, not just in the bones, but in the soul. It was the kind of cold that crept in when the fire burned low, the food stores thinned out, and the nights felt endlessly long. And yet somehow they endured. Let's step inside a medieval peasant's home on one of those endless nights. It's pitch dark outside. The only light comes from the flickering fire on the hearth and maybe a tallow candle, if the family could afford to make or trade for one. The children are bundled tightly in blankets, curled like kittens beside their mother. You can hear the wind howling outside, scraping along the wood shutters like some ancient ghost looking for a crack to slip through. But inside, there's life. Someone's humming a tune. A grandmother is spinning wool beside the hearth, her fingers gnarled but steady. A father repairs a broken tool, hands stained and calloused. A toddler giggles as the family dog, probably a scruffy mutt more bone than fluff, licks their toes. That moment, as simple as it is survival in action. Because here's what we forget. Survival in the Middle Ages wasn't just about making it through the night. It was about preserving hope, and one of the strongest forms of hope, skill. See, medieval peasants weren't just farmers. They were tinkerers, makers, fixers, and problem solvers. Winter was the season of repair and preparation. That tool you used every day in the fields. It probably cracked months ago, but now was the time to fix it. That cloak you wore all year, now threadbare. Time to patch it, not because you wanted to, but because there was no other option. In a time when just buying a new one didn't exist, hands were everything. A boy might learn from his father how to twist cord from hemp or mend a wooden handle with a strip of raw hide. A girl might watch her mother turn an old tunic into baby swaddling, using bone needles and thread spun by hand. These weren't hobbies. These were lifelines. And then there were the remedies. You didn't go to a doctor, not unless you lived near a monastery or could afford the rare traveling healer. Instead, you relied on herb lore, passed down from generations of midwives, wise women, and hedge witches. A little dried yarrow for fevers, mullein leaves to ease a cough, a poultice of onions and garlic mashed into goose fat to draw out a chest cold. Sounds strange today, but back then, these were all you had. And often they worked. One thing was clear. Every winter that didn't kill you made you smarter, and tougher, and more resourceful. Now let's talk about faith. Because in those long winters, faith was not just a Sunday thing. It was the invisible blanket wrapped around everything. Faith in God, yes, but also faith in the land, in the seasons, in the promise that spring would return. The local church might be the coldest building in the village, but it was also the most hopeful one. Its bells marked time when the days all blurred together. Its candles burned when yours had long gone out. And its calendar, filled with saints, days, and holy feasts, gave rhythm to the waiting. Candlemas in early February reminded villagers that winter was turning. Just a little, just enough. And that mattered. Because when every day feels like a battle, even the suggestion that warmth is coming can keep you going. There's also something quietly powerful about the fact that medieval peasants saw themselves as part of a divine order, a place in a larger story. Life was hard, yes, but it wasn't meaningless. Suffering was part of a path, and so was survival. But here's what's really beautiful. When spring did come, when that first green shoot pushed through the thawing earth, when the river ice cracked and the birds came back, it didn't just signal the end of winter. It felt like resurrection. UD survived. Again. UD made it through the bone-cold dark, the empty larder, the frostbitten toes, the nights when you weren't sure if you'd wake up. And that survival wasn't quiet, it was celebrated. The village would erupt in activity. Repairs began, fields were turned, livestock were counted and blessed. Babies born in the deep freeze finally opened their eyes to sunlight. And maybe, just maybe, a traveling merchant arrived with spices or salt or a new story to tell. Every peasant knew the cold would come again. But for now, the thaw meant one thing: life goes on. And maybe that's the heart of this whole story. Medieval peasants didn't outwit winter with gadgets or technology. They didn't conquer it. They endured it, side by side, year after year, with cracked hands, strong hearts, stubborn minds, and the belief that no matter how cold the night gets, the sun always rises. Now imagine this. It's just after dawn on the first true spring morning. The frost has lifted from the thatch, and for the first time in what feels like ages, the fields don't crunch underfoot. There's mud now, thick, messy, glorious mud, and it's welcomed. Because that means warmth. That means the earth is ready. And so are the people. A medieval village doesn't waste time. The very moment the ground begins to soften, peasants are out with crude wooden plows, shoulder to shoulder with oxen, or if they were too poor to own animals, using sheer human muscle to dig into the soil. Every seed matters. Every inch of land is valuable. This isn't just farming, it's reawakening. But before we go charging into spring, let's pull back and appreciate why this moment meant so much. Winter wasn't just physically brutal, it was a season of loss. Food stores often ran dangerously low by February. Salted meat spoiled, root vegetables went soft or moldy, and grain was stretched thinner and thinner. Many villagers, especially the elderly and very young, didn't make it to spring. That's the unspoken part of survival. So when you did survive, it wasn't just personal triumph. It was a quiet victory for the entire village. You became a living memory of the ones who didn't, and that in itself carried weight. In that way, every task in early spring was sacred. Planting barley, beans, or rye wasn't just agricultural, it was emotional. You were laying down life again, rebuilding not just a pantry but a future. But of course, even with the thaw, the cold didn't vanish overnight. Nights in early spring could still dip below freezing. And without central heating, families relied on the same old tricks, huddling together, stuffing rushes between cracks in the walls, boiling herbs to breathe easier in damp air. They knew that winter could take a step backward before it left for good. Still, the pace shifted. People smiled more. There was more singing. Children, finally able to run barefoot, played in the meadows, even if their toes were still purple from months without shoes. The psychological effect of light returning can't be overstated. Think about it, in the dead of winter, daylight might last 8 hours or less, if you were lucky. Fires and candles stretched the day, but those resources weren't endless. Most people adjusted their sleep cycles, following the natural rhythm of dark and light. But once spring arrived, it was like someone flipped a switch. Days stretched longer, and with it, so did hope. And speaking of sleep, here's something you might not know. Medieval peasants didn't sleep the way we do, especially in winter. There was something called first sleep and second sleep. The idea was simple. People would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for a few hours, wake up in the middle of the night, stay awake for an hour or two, maybe praying, maybe talking quietly, even doing small chores, and then go back to sleep until dawn. Strange, maybe to us, but in a world ruled by nature's rhythm, it made perfect sense. And that middle-of-the-night wakefulness, for many, it became a time of reflection, intimacy, even creativity. No phones, no rush, just quiet. Just the sound of the fire's last embers crackling and maybe a rooster grumbling in the dark. You can imagine it. A mother cradling a baby back to sleep while whispering old stories. A husband fixing a wooden spoon by candlelight. A teenager gazing out into the black sky, counting stars and dreaming of places they'll never go but still like to imagine. Even in the coldest seasons, life found its own rhythm. Not perfect, not painless, but real. And now, with spring clawing its way back, the village stretched like a waking animal. Farmers plotted out their rotations, which fields would rest, which would host oats, where to scatter flax. Women scrubbed linens in still icy streams, chattering as their fingers turned red. Children helped turn compost pits, laughing as they threw muck and straw into furrows. This was the part of the year when the workload exploded, and everyone from toddlers to grandparents had a role to play. But even with all that effort, even with all the bustling, they never forgot the cold. They talked about it, recounted who fell ill, who had to butcher the last pig early, who nearly froze on the road back from the forest. These stories weren't complaints, they were oral memory, a way to stay ready for the next time, because everyone knew winter always came back, and so they prepared. Even as spring bloomed, people began their slow ritual of getting ahead, salting fish, drying herbs, setting traps, preserving eggs in ashes or lime water. Every act of preservation was an act of hope, a promise to the future. It's easy for us now. We push a button for heat, stockpile canned goods, flick on lights when the sun goes down. But for them, every ounce of security had to be earned in sweat, soot, or frostbite. And yet somehow many of them didn't just survive, they found meaning. Beauty, even, in a child's giggle when the first flower peeked out, in the way the community came together to raise a collapsed roof or dig out a snow-buried path, in the quiet pride of keeping the hearth burning one more night. It wasn't a romantic life, but it was a resilient one. And for all the backbreaking labor, hunger, and bitter nights, medieval peasants taught us something we shouldn't forget. Sometimes the greatest strength doesn't come from fighting the cold. It comes from learning how to live with it. And just when you think the worst is over, there's a different kind of challenge waiting in the wings: sickness. Because spring wasn't just the season of new growth. It was also the season of old illnesses making their rounds again. See, winter kept people cooped up indoors, sharing the same stale air, breathing close in tiny spaces with poor ventilation. But spring, that's when the symptoms started blooming just like the flowers. Coughs, fevers, and worse, all lingering from the damp, smoky conditions of winter living. We're talking about a time before germ theory, before antibiotics, before hand sanitizer or even regular soap. Disease spread silently and fast, and if a harsh winter didn't take you through starvation or frostbite, spring might just catch you off guard with something like dysentery, typhoid, or consumption. And yet life moved forward. When someone fell ill, there wasn't much a peasant family could do. Maybe brew some elderflower tea, burn dried rosemary to cleanse the air, or stuff herbs into pillows. If you were lucky, the village had a local healer, a wise woman or a monk who knew a little something about plants, poultices, and prayer. But more often than not, healing came down to warmth, rest, and a whole lot of hope. Still, it's amazing how much knowledge was passed down, knowledge about keeping warm and keeping well. Like layering clothing, not just for warmth, but for insulation and moisture wicking, even if they didn't use those words. Or building sleeping platforms a few inches off the ground to avoid the chill that radiated from the dirt floors. Or the classic peasant trick, placing a warmed stone wrapped in wool at the foot of the bed, almost like a medieval hot water bottle. They may not have had modern medicine, but their survival instincts were razor sharp. And what's even more impressive, they didn't just survive for themselves, They did it for each other. See, peasants didn't live in isolation. Villages were tight-knit webs of dependency. One man's harvest fed another man's children. One woman's herbs treated a neighbor's cough. They helped birth each other's babies. They shared meat when a pig was slaughtered. They repaired roofs together after a storm. They were interwoven. Because if there was one thing the cold taught you year after year, it was this: you're only as strong as your weakest neighbor. And that belief, it made all the difference. Take firewood, for example. It was precious, and gathering it meant hours of labor, sometimes even risking wolves in the forest or frostbite on the hands. But if an elderly widow couldn't manage the task herself, the village helped. They brought bundles. They chopped kindling, because no one wanted to hear of someone freezing to death 2 doors down, not when you had strength to spare. Or take food. If a family's stores ran out in late winter, if their salted pork went bad or their grain spoiled, there was shame, sure. But there was also grace. Neighbors quietly left baskets. A few onions here, a piece of cheese there. They didn't call it charity, they called it duty. They didn't have social safety nets. They were the net. And this sense of shared survival was most visible in their festivals, especially as spring turned toward early summer. May Day, for example. It wasn't just a celebration of fertility and the growing season. It was a release. A reminder that, yes, the darkest days were behind them. Villagers danced, sang, drank homemade mead, and crowned May queens with wildflowers. But behind the joy was a deep, collective relief. Relief that another winter had passed. That their children were still breathing. That the fields were greening. That life, in all its messy, muddy beauty, had come back around. And as they danced around maypoles or lit bonfires under the stars, they weren't just celebrating nature. They were celebrating resilience. The same resilience that had carried them through the longest, coldest nights, huddled together in silence. And now, with warm earth underfoot and sun on their faces, they could finally breathe easy again, at least for a little while. Because deep down they knew another winter would come. It always did. But so would the firewood, and the stories, and the bread, and the blankets patched and mended for another year. And most importantly, so would the people. The same people who had helped you carry that frozen body from the barn to the fire. The same people who had shared their eggs and whispered their prayers when you were sick. The same people who knew, without being told, what it took to survive. They didn't call themselves heroes, but every time they pulled through another season, that's exactly what they were. So, the next time you bundle up for a chilly night or complain that the heater's not warm enough, remember them. The villagers, the peasants, the quiet fighters of the frost. And know this, they didn't just endure, they lived. And in their small, smoky, stubborn homes, lit only by flame and filled with the breath of those who refused to give up, they taught us all a little something about how to survive and how to keep going. But let's not paint the whole village with too soft a brush. Yes, community mattered. Yes, people shared. But winter wasn't a fairy tale. When food was low and desperation crept in, things got complicated. There were moments, especially in the harshest years, when even the strongest communities buckled under the pressure. When survival meant making choices no one wanted to talk about. Imagine this. It's mid-February. The snow is deep and it hasn't stopped in days. The grain stores are nearly empty. The salted meat is long gone. You're burning furniture for firewood. And your youngest child, curled up by the hearth, hasn't spoken since yesterday. At that point, mercy and desperation blur. Some peasants did what they had to do. They begged. They scavenged. Some may have even stolen, slipping into barns at night to borrow eggs or break into someone's precious food chest, hoping not to get caught. And if they were caught, punishment wasn't always kind. Theft, even in hunger, was still theft. Village justice could be swift, a public shaming, stocks, or worse. You might find yourself exiled from the very community you needed to survive. But still, these weren't criminals. These were starving people trying to hold on. And if you look closely at the records, the few that survived, you'll find something striking. Even in the coldest winters, violence between villagers was rare. Why? Because everyone knew the cost of turning against your neighbor. You see, winter in medieval times was more than a season. It was a pressure cooker. It squeezed every part of life, from what you ate to how you thought to who you could trust. And it revealed things about people, some ugly, but some beautiful too. Now let's talk about hope. Hope was a survival strategy just as much as fire or grain. Because if you didn't believe spring would come, you wouldn't last through January. So they built hope into their daily routines. They told stories by firelight, tales of brave ancestors, of saints and spirits, of summers past and feasts yet to come. They sang songs while spinning wool or repairing tools, rhythmic chants passed down for generations, full of longing and warmth. Even their prayers whispered every morning, every night weren't just spiritual. They were survival, a way to center the mind, a reminder that they weren't powerless even when the world outside froze solid. You want to know something strange? In many villages, laughter survived winter too. Crude jokes, sled races on frozen paths, little games made up by children with nothing but sticks and snow. Somehow, they found joy in the cracks. Because if there's one thing medieval peasants understood, maybe better than we do today, it's this. You don't survive a hard winter by being strong alone. You survive by being human together, by letting someone else borrow your last candle stub, by splitting the last bit of broth 3 ways instead of 2, by believing, really believing that the sun will come back. And when it finally did, when the frost loosened its grip and the first green buds poked through the earth, there was no dramatic celebration, just quiet, grateful work. They planted again. They patched roofs. They cleaned soot from walls and opened shutters to let light in. And they prepared not just for summer, but for the next winter. Because in medieval life, the cold was never just something you endured once. It was a rhythm, a cycle, one you had to learn to dance with, even if you hated the music. That's why peasants made their clothes thicker with every stitch. Why they passed down fire-tending tricks from grandfather to grandson. Why even the youngest children knew how to spot which logs burned longer, which bark to peel, which holes in the walls needed mending before the frost returned. They didn't have thermostats, or hot showers, or central heating. What they had was memory of hardship, of resilience, of survival. And they passed that memory down not through books or scrolls, but through habits, through stories, through how you lit the fire and where you placed the bread and how you folded a cloak around a shivering child. Their lives were not grand, but they were grounded. And somehow, through all the bone-deep cold and endless dark, they kept going. Year after year, generation after generation, until one day someone looked back and said, "Those peasants, they were just poor." But the truth, they were more than poor, they were tough, they were wise. They were the quiet masters of survival, wrapped in wool, soaked in smoke, and singing into the dark. And the cold, it never beat them. It just taught them how to endure. But winter wasn't just a test of the body, it was a crucible for the spirit. And in the middle of that bitter season, when the sky stayed gray for days, when the wind sliced through bone and no bird dared sing, something remarkable often happened. People dreamed. Maybe it's because there was so little else to do after dark. Or maybe it's because when you're surrounded by cold and silence, your imagination becomes your most powerful refuge. Whatever the reason, winter nights were when visions were born, not just of survival, but of something better. Sitting near dying embers, families would whisper about next year's harvest, about land they might one day lease, or even, in rare moments of boldness, what life might be like without a lord above them. Peasants weren't blind. They knew the system was stacked, that their taxes fed the nobles' feasts while their own tables stayed bare, that the woods were full of game they couldn't hunt, that even the sun seemed to rise first over the manor house. But in winter, with everything stripped away and time stretched thin, people imagined other ways of living. A warm room, a loaf of bread without hunger beside it, maybe even a child who didn't have to freeze just to learn what work meant. That kind of dreaming wasn't rebellion, not yet, but it was the root of change. The soft beginnings of questions that would one day shake kingdoms. Now, back to daily life, to the sheer physical grind of making it through January. You'd think by now we'd have mentioned food more, right? And for good reason. Because hunger was the single loudest sound in a peasant's winter. Even when you did have food, it was boring. Gruel, porridge, dried peas, turnips. Barley cakes so tough you could use them as doorstops. And then there was pottage, a never-ending stew pot where whatever scraps you had went in. Day after day, week after week. The flavor changed depending on what was thrown in, sometimes cabbage, sometimes beans, maybe a bone if you were lucky. It was peasant soup in the purest sense. Nothing wasted, everything stretched. Fermented food was also a quiet savior. Sauerkraut and pickled roots kept the gut alive through the long months. And ale, that wasn't a luxury. It was often safer to drink than the water. Even children had small beer, a weak brew just strong enough to kill bacteria. Winter food wasn't meant to satisfy, it was meant to sustain. And peasants, more than anyone, knew how to stretch a crumb into a meal, a frost-covered field into a plan, a single chicken into 5 different uses. They also knew how to listen to the animals, to the wind, to the silence between snowfalls. You see, in a world without clocks or calendars, time was felt in your bones. You could tell how close the thaw was by how the ice cracked on the pond, or how the pigs grunted differently when they knew spring was near. Animals were part of the winter rhythm too. Cows were brought into barns not just for warmth, but for their breath, yes, their breath, to help heat the space. Chickens slept in corners, goats beside doors. Every bit of shared heat mattered. And when an animal got sick or worse, died, that wasn't just a loss of food. That was a hit to your survival equation. But again, the village pulled together. Sometimes you'd borrow an animal, sometimes you'd share. Because while ownership mattered, life mattered more. Now, let's take a moment to think about clothing. Forget what you've seen in movies. Peasants didn't have closets full of outfits. They had maybe two, often one for working and sleeping both. Wool was their best friend. Thick, scratchy, heavy wool. Tunics layered over leggings. Cloaks draped tight and pinned at the shoulder. Hoods that covered both head and neck. Gloves were rare, mittens were more common. And shoes, often just leather soles tied with cord. If those wore through, you stuffed your feet with straw and hoped for the best. But peasants were clever. They lined their clothes with moss, sewed bits of fur into collars, wove felted scraps into insulation for their caps. Nothing was wasted. Even lice, yes, lice, were tolerated because picking them off took time no one had to spare. And let's not forget the hearth. The fire wasn't just for cooking. It was the center of the home. Every conversation, every song, every plan was made within its glow. Children slept as close to it as possible. Babies sometimes nestled in wooden cradles pulled near the embers. Bread was baked on stones beside it. Water warmed in clay pots set into the coals. And if the fire went out, you didn't just lose heat, you lost time. Restarting a fire wasn't as simple as striking a match. It could take hours, even days if your flint was damp or your kindling was scarce. That's why keeping fire alive became almost sacred. Some villages even had one family keep a communal flame, sharing it with others when theirs went out. Fire wasn't just utility. It was a symbol of life itself. And in those long nights when the wind howled and the walls creaked, when the animals snorted in their sleep and the snow fell silently outside, the fire crackled. It was small, it was stubborn, and it was enough. Because the truth is, medieval peasants didn't survive winter through strength alone. They survived it through rituals, not just religious ones, but practical ones. Stack the wood just so. Stir the pot clockwise. Patch the roof before the frost sets in. Say the morning prayer. Check the traps. Knock the snow off the shutters. Kiss the baby's forehead. Repeat, over and over. Because when everything around you wants to stop, the sun, the crops, your own energy, you keep going by repeating what works. And those rituals, they carried people through more than just snowstorms. They carried them through generations. Even in the bleakest part of winter, life had to move forward. There were still mouths to feed, tools to mend, and souls to keep warm, not just with fire, but with hope. And sometimes, that hope came in the form of a story. After a day of hauling water through crusted snow and checking the animal pens for signs of frostbite, people would gather, not for fun necessarily, but for comfort. Maybe a neighbor stopped by to return a borrowed blade. Maybe the old widow 2 huts down brought her spindle and some tales from her youth. And as the wind rattled the shutters and the fire spit sparks into the darkness, someone, maybe the grandfather, maybe the shepherd's daughter, would start to talk. Not preaching, not even performing, just remembering, of winters colder than this one, of wolves seen near the edge of the woods, of a time when the river froze so solid that someone walked across it without sinking. Or maybe they'd talk about spirits, because you better believe medieval peasants had stories for the dark. There was the black dog with glowing eyes that followed travelers too far from the village, or the white lady who wandered the woods, weeping into the snow. Some swore they'd heard singing under the ice on certain nights, voices that weren't human. These stories weren't meant to scare so much as explain. When the world feels unforgiving, you need something to hang the mystery on. And in those long, cold months, with the stars sharper than usual and the wind whispering through the trees like breath on your neck, it made sense that something unseen might be out there. But not all winter stories were sad. Some were funny stories of a cow that escaped into a church, or a pig that learned how to open the grain bin, or the time two brothers accidentally built their outhouse over the neighbor's well and didn't realize it until spring. Because laughter, even in the dark, is resistance, and peasants knew that well, just like they knew the rhythm of the stars. You see, even without books or watches, medieval people understood time deeply. They read it in the sky. They watched the stars shift from east to west. They saw how Orion's belt rose earlier each week, how the North Star never moved, how certain constellations disappeared as the months changed. They didn't need a calendar to know that Candlemas was coming. They could feel it in the air, in the slight lengthening of the day, in the way the animals started acting differently. Candlemas, early February, was a holy day, yes. But more than that, it was a marker. We've made it halfway. Halfway through winter. Halfway through the worst. It meant that spring wasn't a dream anymore, it was a promise. And so, the villagers would bless their candles. They'd walk through the fields with them, lighting the way for the season to come. It was symbolic, sure, but also deeply psychological. Because if you've survived this far, you can survive the rest. Still, there were always those who didn't make it. That's the part no one liked to talk about, but everyone remembered. An old man who couldn't get warm, even under 3 cloaks. A baby whose breath slowed and stopped sometime after midnight. A woman who coughed for weeks until she didn't anymore. Death wasn't an abstraction in the Middle Ages. It was a neighbor, a frequent visitor, sometimes silent, sometimes cruel, but always present. And yet, here's the part that'll stick with you: people kept going anyway. They kept hauling the wood. They kept stirring the pot. They kept telling the stories. Because that's how you fight the cold, not just with firewood and blankets, but with meaning. And in that sense, the medieval peasant wasn't just surviving the coldest nights. They were redefining what endurance looked like. They were showing that a life lived close to the earth, with little margin for error, could still be full of connection, laughter, belief, and quiet bravery. Even their celebrations were timed to keep spirits alive during the deadest part of the year. Ever heard of Plough Monday? It came right after Epiphany, in early January. It was the symbolic return to field work, the idea that the plow would soon break the frozen ground again. In some villages, the plow would be decorated and dragged through the streets while people sang and asked for blessings on the crops to come. Coins might be tossed, ale might be passed. It wasn't extravagant, but it was something. A way to say, we're still here. We're still planting. And maybe most importantly, we believe there will be a harvest. Now think about that. In the middle of the worst part of winter, people celebrated a plow, a tool, a symbol of what might be possible. That's the kind of thinking that doesn't just survive a season. It survives a century. Because medieval peasants weren't just scraping by. They were planting seeds, literal and spiritual, that their children and their children's children would harvest. They didn't have much, but they had what mattered most, each other, belief, and a fire, however small, that never quite went out. And just when you think you've wrapped your head around how these folks endured the cold, the hunger, the dark, the loss, you start to realize something deeper. They weren't just surviving winter. They were building a life within it. Take the art of layering, for instance. Not fashion, not style, just pure, hard-earned knowledge of how to keep the heat in and the frostbite out. Wool was their best friend. If you were lucky, you had 2 layers, an under tunic and a thicker outer one. If you were poor, maybe just one, but you'd patch it, fold it, wrap it tight until it held what little warmth your body could produce. Linen undergarments helped wick away sweat, and yes, even in winter, peasants could break a sweat. Hauling frozen logs, chopping kindling, dragging water through snow. You'd be working constantly just to stay warm and keep your blood moving. And then there were the clever tricks. They'd stuff straw into their shoes to create extra insulation, tie wool around the wrists and ankles to block drafts, sleep with their heads under the covers, even when that meant waking up to frost clinging to the inside of their nose. People talk about medieval hacks like it's a joke, but back then, those little adjustments made the difference between losing a toe and keeping one more season of mobility. But physical tricks were only half the game. Mindset mattered too. When you're stuck in a single room day after day with the same people, same smells, same meager food, you either lose your mind or you learn how to mentally travel. That's where memory came in, where songs lived, where old proverbs circled the fire like warm blankets. The past became a source of heat, a place to draw strength. They told stories not just to pass the time, but to remind themselves who they were. And then there were the animals. You might think a chicken's only good for eggs or stew, but in the middle of winter, animals doubled as space heaters. Literally. In many medieval homes, animals slept indoors, not just for safety, but for warmth. Cows radiated heat like big, slow-breathing furnaces. Chickens huddled in crates or corners. A pig might grunt beneath a straw blanket beside the hearth. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly clean, but it worked. And in return, the animals survived too. Because when you only own 2 sheep and 1 cow, you do whatever it takes to keep them alive until spring. They were more than livestock. They were lifelines. And speaking of survival, let's not forget how the body changes with experience. Over time, medieval peasants developed a kind of internal resilience. Their skin thickened, their joints adjusted. Their daily movement, squatting, bending, lifting, kept them in functional shape. Not fit like a knight, but fit enough to stack hay, swing an axe, carry water, and walk miles through snow without thinking twice. Cold wasn't an enemy to be conquered. It was a companion, One you had to live with, negotiate with, and respect. They knew which spots in the cottage never warmed up. They knew which herbs to chew to fight congestion. They knew how to blow on their hands just right to ease the stiffness before lifting a pot or sharpening a blade. And they passed this knowledge down from mother to daughter, from grandfather to boy. It wasn't written down. It was lived, breathed, repeated until it was muscle memory. And even in death, yes, death, they had rituals. If someone passed during the winter, burial could be delayed. The ground might be frozen solid. So they'd wrap the body in linen, place it in a side room or even a barn, and wait until thaw. And when that time came, they didn't just bury the body. They gathered. They spoke the name aloud, told the story, said the prayer. Because even in the darkest cold, the community made space for grief. You might think survival leaves no room for emotions, but medieval peasants knew better. Grief is part of survival. It's how you honor the cost of making it through. And somehow they always found a way to keep going. You know how, because spring always came. Maybe not with flowers right away. Maybe not even with green, but the signs were there. A softening of the soil, a new sound in the woods, a baby lamb's cry in the distance, the first drip of snowmelt trickling from the roof's edge. And when that happened, peasants didn't leap for joy. They didn't throw a party. They just exhaled like someone letting go of a breath they'd been holding for months. Then they got to work. They tilled the land. They patched their roofs. They cleaned the hearths and shook out the bedding and sharpened the tools. Because that's what survival teaches you. Winter is never permanent, but neither is spring. And every warm day is a borrowed gift, earned in the long, hard silence of the coldest nights. So when you think of medieval peasants, don't just picture dirt and misery and suffering. Picture resilience. Picture wisdom carved into calloused hands. Picture families huddled close, telling stories under thick wool blankets, listening to the wind and waiting for the next morning's sun. They survived not because they were stronger than us, but because they learned to live with the cold, not against it. And somehow, in that ancient frostbitten world, they managed to carry the fire of humanity forward all the way to us. And now, as we sit in heated homes with the flick of a switch and hot water on command, it's almost hard to imagine what it meant to survive a medieval winter. No thermostat, no fleece-lined boots, just instinct, community, and a stubborn will to see the sun again. But here's the thing. We don't just study their lives because we're curious. We study them because they remind us of something essential, something we've forgotten. That the human spirit was never about comfort. It was about endurance, about huddling together when the cold comes, not just outside, but inside too. It was about making soup from scraps, spinning joy out of repetition, and finding warmth in places where there shouldn't be any. A fire shared, a song remembered, a neighbor who knocks on your door not because they want something, but because they know you might need something. Today, in our fast-paced world, we talk a lot about survival. Survival of the fittest. Survival as self-reliance. But medieval peasants didn't survive winters alone. They survived because of each other. Because someone remembered how to dry herbs properly for tea that soothed a cough. Because someone else repaired the roof with thatch handed down from the last harvest. Because a grandmother taught her granddaughter to patch a blanket, and a father showed his son how to place the stones in a hearth so the smoke wouldn't choke the room. It wasn't grand. It wasn't heroic. It was just life. Cold, honest, rough-edged, but real. And in many ways, maybe the most human kind of life. Because when you've got nothing but a few candles, a stew pot, and a promise that spring will return, that's when the real beauty of humanity shows up. Not in glory, but in grit. In the way they watched the sky and understood its moods. In the way they kept stories alive not because they were bored, but because they needed hope. In the way they could sit in silence and still feel held by the presence of others in the room. And now, centuries later, their story is still here. Their footsteps still echo on the stone floors of abandoned cottages. Their handprints are still pressed into the old timber beams. And in some small way, their strength runs through us too. Because maybe deep down, we all carry that instinct, that ancient knowledge of what to do when the cold comes. We seek the fire. We gather close. We endure. So next time the night feels long and your world feels cold in more ways than one, remember them. The peasants who stood shoulder to shoulder beneath frost-covered roofs, whispering prayers into the darkness, holding onto the ember of one more sunrise. They weren't just surviving winter. They were defining what it means to be human. And that, friends, is a story worth remembering. Thanks for staying with me tonight. If you felt something during this journey, a chill, a warmth, a moment of quiet awe, consider hitting that like button, subscribing and sharing this with someone who needs a reminder of what real strength looks like. I'll see you next time, and until then, stay warm.